think the net effect that, with that background in mind, then I think one can understand why something such as MontaVista Linux 6 needed to be done. And MontaVista 6 is it's the first Linux distribution for embedded systems, I think anyway, that's been produced in the post-victory phase, so to speak. After Linux has won, it's sort of MontaVista Rev 2 in the sense of, okay, so now you've won, you've really got to examine everything you do in terms of engineering and product development and even product specification to kind of exist now in this, the winning side of the business. And I think another aspect of kind of being in this post-victory stage is the ascendancy in general, not only of Linux, but open source technology for the development of devices of all kinds. And if in the old model it was kind of a closed universe, as the RTOS business is, the polar opposite almost is the open model as exemplified by open source. And it's not that it's uniformly done, but just the notion of how open source works, from starting with Linux, but many other middleware application and tool pieces. There's a general way in which the open source processes work. And I think another matter or part of MontaVista 6 is that the way it's delivered and the way it sort of installs itself in a general sense into the customer's development environment is absolutely consistent with the way in which open source projects like to package themselves and like to use source as the foundation of how the technology is developed. And so the kind of underpinnings of MontaVista 6 on the technical side for Linux is being consistent with the semiconductor distributions, being a superset of the semiconductor distributions. On the kind of open source side, it's being very consistent with the way in which sources are used, how they're managed, the processes involved in utilizing open source, how they're packaged, whether it's RPM or other kind of package mechanisms. But it's basically to be very transparent in the customer's engineering environment and to be very friendly with the way in which other open source pieces will be combined to produce the final product, the software product that the customer's building. And that's a very, you got to be a real software engineer and understand software process, as we see in some of the video from Joe Green. But if you're a practicing engineer, how our stuff fits into your environment and how it integrates with other open source pieces that you might be using, you'll find dramatically different and dramatically and smoothly integrated with the open source processes that we draw upon. And I think it's a more subtle part of MontaVista 6 in some ways. It's called the integration platform, but it's a real recognition of the pervasive role that open source is playing in making sure that we don't thwart that pervasive role, but rather grease the skids and otherwise fit into a very dominating part of the engineering efforts that our customers, the kind of characteristics of the engineering processes that our customers have to use to put together their products. But I think the way I'd like to characterize the overall impact that we'd like to have on this is it's one of amplification with our customers as opposed to fighting. You can argue it at some level if a very common means of using Linux is do it yourself. And I fall into this all the time, so I have to be careful. But if you're a supplier, a very common then position is to sort of argue with the customer about about whether they should be doing things themselves. And it's an interesting spot to be in. But I thought of a way of characterizing this, I think, that's complementary to our engineering customers, and yet actually does frame, I think, the right question to be asking. And I think if we can have our customers ask this question, and it's why we are successful, it's a positive answer. And the way it goes is this, just to remind everybody that the decision to use Linux in an embedded device is certainly, in almost all cases now, it's pretty obvious, the right decision. Technically, it's a good platform to be basing your application on. And I think we've proven that along with our customers for years now. What I want everybody to ask is, or to think about is, okay, if that's the right technical decision, and a good one, what's the right business decision to accompany that? In other words, now that I've technically decided to use Linux, let's go understand the business implications of using Linux and whether we should do things ourselves or have a supplier, and what's the best for our business to amplify the technical decision that we've already made. And I think if people approach it that way, and with our help, they can see that clearly the right technical decision is to have chosen Linux, and we think, and we can demonstrate very clearly, that the right business decision is to choose